Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with a further update as to what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about oil revenues and what's going on with regards to OPEC+. Because this week, President Putin made an unexpected visit to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, both of which are major oil producers, and the outcome of those meetings was a further announcement that OPEC+, the consortium that controls around 40% of the global supply of oil, are further cutting their production to push prices back up. And these continued announcements by OPEC+ that they're cutting the supply of oil are really interesting, because the oil markets are a barometer of what's happening globally. When demand goes up, so does the price of oil. When demand comes down, the price of oil follows. And the reason that demand is falling at the moment is because the global economy is slowing down. China is producing less than expected and therefore is buying less oil, and the rest of the world is also in a slowdown pattern, and that's why oil prices are therefore in decline. But rather than going with market sentiment, OPEC+ have decided that if they cut the supply, then that resets the equilibrium between supply and demand and will push prices back up. And that's all very well for countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who are cash rich and can afford the luxury of sitting back, waiting for prices to go up, reducing supply, and therefore earning more per barrel, but potentially less overall in terms of volume sales. But from Russia's point of view, it's much more of a difficult pill to swallow, because at the moment, Russia needs as much income as it can get. The economy is in decline and huge amounts are being spent on the war in Ukraine. So the last thing that President Putin wants to do realistically is to cut back on supplies. However, over the last 6 months, as part of their membership of OPEC+, Russia have confirmed cuts of 500,000 barrels and an additional 300,000. So that's 800,000 barrels of oil per day that Russia are no longer selling into the markets. And at the current price of around $56 per barrel for a barrel of Russian crude oil, that means that Russia, by doing these voluntary cuts, has lost $50 million per day, or around $18 billion of revenue, and that has got to hurt. So in today's video, I'll have a look at exactly what's been happening with oil prices that have forced OPEC+ to announce these further cuts. We'll also have a look at what's happening with Russian oil prices. We'll then talk about President Putin's trip to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And when he goes on holiday these days, he doesn't travel alone. He takes 4 fighter jets with him, just in case there's any trouble in the air. So we'll have a look at those fighter jets out of the window of President Putin's plane. We'll then talk about the international arrest warrant that was issued in March for President Putin's arrest for potential war crimes, and why neither Saudi Arabia nor the United Arab Emirates arranged for his arrest. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the impacts of these cuts are for the Russian economy and what's likely to happen over the course of the next 3 to 6 months. But before we get started on all of that, as always, I would like to say thank you so much to everybody that's bought me a coffee, sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a Patreon or a member. I really, really appreciate it. And also thanks to everybody that's posted comments in the section below, apart from obviously all the spam comments that I get about the latest Amazon Bitcoin, or how somebody is earning $50,000 per minute from their investment with Mr. Marshall, or anything like that. So please, if you're doing those ones, don't bother. But everybody else, thank you so much.
The group of oil-producing nations known as OPEC+ is cutting supply by nearly 2 million barrels a day beginning next year. The decision came during a virtual meeting to discuss 2024 output amid concerns the market faces a potential surplus. OPEC+, which is led by Saudi Arabia and includes member allies such as Russia, pumps more than 40% of the world's oil. The group's current output already reflects cuts of about 5 million barrels a day, aimed at supporting prices and stabilizing the market. Oil prices first rose on the news by more than 1%, but by Thursday afternoon had reversed course, with U.S. crude dropping by nearly 2.5% to under $76 a barrel. One expert told Reuters there is a high degree of skepticism on how individual OPEC Plus members will reach their voluntary cuts, going so far as to call the plan sketchy. He added that the UAE, for example, is supposed to be increasing production by 200,000 barrels per day by 2024. OPEC Plus is focused on lower output with prices down from nearly $98 a barrel in late September, and concerns brewing over weaker economic growth in 2024.
Saudi Arabia and Russia, the world's two biggest oil exporters, have called for all OPEC Plus members to join an agreement on output cuts for the good of the global economy. Hours after Russian President Vladimir Putin flew to Riyadh in a hastily arranged visit to meet Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the Kremlin released a joint Russian-Saudi statement about the conclusion of their discussions. The Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, Russia and other allies agreed last week to new voluntary cuts of around 2.2 million barrels per day, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, rolling over their voluntary cuts of 1.3 million barrels per day. The statement released by the Kremlin said, "In the field of energy, the two sides commended the close cooperation between them and the successful efforts of the OPEC Plus countries in enhancing the stability of global oil markets. They stressed the importance of continuing the cooperation and the need for all participating countries to join the OPEC Plus agreement in a way that serves the interests of producers and consumers and supports the growth of the global economy." The Russian version used the word join, while an English translation of the statement, also released by the Kremlin, used the word adhere to the OPEC Plus agreement. Saudi state news agency SPA said that the Crown Prince, known as MBS, and Putin had emphasised in their meeting the need for OPEC Plus members to commit to the group's agreement. Oil market sources said that such an explicit public remark from the Kremlin and the Kingdom about joining cuts appeared to be an attempt to send a message to members of the OPEC Plus club who had not cut or not cut enough. The biggest member of OPEC excluded from the cuts is Iran, the economy of which has been under various US sanctions since 1979 and the seizure of the US embassy in Tehran. Iran is boosting production and hopes to reach output of 3.6 million barrels per day by March 20th, 2024. After his return from Moscow from Saudi Arabia, President Putin held talks with Iranian President Ebrahim Raisi in the Kremlin, along with Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Mystery still surrounds President Putin's trip to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, on which he was escorted by 4 Russian fighter jets, and it was not immediately clear what particular issue was so important for Putin to make a rare trip overseas. The Kremlin said Putin and MBS also discussed the conflict in Gaza, Ukraine and Yemen, the Iranian nuclear program and deepening defence cooperation. MBS had sought to reassert Saudi Arabia as a regional power with less deference to the United States. However, interestingly, Saudi Arabia is the biggest purchaser of US arms. With regards to the crisis in Ukraine, the Russian side expressed appreciation for the humanitarian and political efforts undertaken by His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman, the joint statement said. OPEC Plus, the members of which pump more than 40% of the world's oil, had to delay its meeting over disagreements with African producers about output, though some traders said they suspected deeper problems within the group. After the producers decided to cut supply, oil prices fell to a 5-month low, a clear sign that the market had expected more forthright action from OPEC+. Putin and MBS, who together control a fifth of the oil pumped each day, were shown smiling and engaging in an effusive handshake as Putin emerged from his car in the Saudi capital. Both MBS, who's 38, and Putin, who's 71, want and need high prices for oil, the lifeblood of their economies. The question for both is how much of the burden should each take to keep prices aloft. At the talks with MBS, Putin said a planned visit by the prince to Russia had been changed at the last minute, prompting him to visit Riyadh. This chart shows the movement in the price of Brent crude oil over the last 5 years, and the reason I wanted to go back 5 years is to really look at the impact that Russia's invasion of Ukraine had on oil prices. Now, interestingly, as you can see, the current price of a barrel of oil is around $75. And that was actually the price that oil was trading at in December 2021. And as you can see from the chart, between the end of December 21 and the end of February 22, the price of a barrel of oil rose from $75 to $120, and this movement was caused directly by what Russia was doing in Ukraine. During January, Russia started to mass troops on the border of Ukraine, and this action caused concern in the oil markets that something was going to happen, and as a result of that, prices started to go up, and then immediately following the invasion, which started on the 24th of February, the price spiked. And the price of a barrel of oil remained above $75 for the remainder of 2022. However, at the start of 2023, prices started to fall as concerns about a global slowdown started to spread. At that stage, OPEC Plus decided that it wanted to take action to push the price of oil back up, and nations including Saudi Arabia announced that they were cutting back on production to reduce the supply of oil and therefore push prices up. Initially, this did have the desired effect, and prices rose to around $90 per barrel in April. However, as concerns started to rise about the strength of the Chinese economy, prices came back down, and OPEC Plus were forced into making further announcements on cuts, including announcements from Russia that it was cutting back 500,000 barrels per day from August and a further 300,000 barrels per day in September. So a total cutback from Russia's perspective of 800,000 barrels per day, which represents around 16% of the 5 million barrels per day that Russia exports. And if we change the scale of the chart to show what's been happening over the last 6 months, you can see that between June and September, the supply cut announcements had the desired effect, pushing the price of a barrel of oil back up above $90. However, over the last 3 months, the slowdown in the global economy has outweighed the supply cuts, and the price of oil has fallen to its lowest level for around 2 years. If we now have a look at what's happened to the price of Russian oil, the chart shows that in March 22, immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the price of Russian oil was trading for around $100 per barrel. As the impact of the sanctions kicked in, that price fell to around $70 per barrel. However, as the global price of oil rose in June, it got back up to around $100. However, between June 22 and March 23, as the sanctions kicked in against Russia, and Russia was forced to offer discounts to encourage buyers to take oil products, the price of a barrel of Russian crude oil fell to a low of $46. Now, the price of Russian oil has subsequently recovered and interestingly went above the $60 per barrel cap that was imposed by the G7 as a result of Russia finding other ways to be able to transport its oil rather than using tankers and insurance provided by the G7, and hit a recent high of $83 per barrel in September. However, over the last 3 months, in line with what's been happening generally with oil prices, the price of Russian crude has fallen and is now sitting at around $56 per barrel. And this represents a serious problem for Russia because when you're exporting 5 million barrels of oil per day, every time the price of a barrel of oil falls by $1, it means that Russia is losing $5 million of revenue per day. So taking into account the fact that the price of a barrel of Russian oil has fallen from $83 at the end of September to $56 today, that $27 fall per barrel equates to a reduction of $135 million per day for Russia, which on an annualized basis is a loss of revenue of around $50 billion. So you can see why Russia is so concerned about the fact that oil prices are currently falling.
17th of March 2023, the International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. It is forbidden by international law for occupied powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention. This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
So President Putin recently landed in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, So why wasn't he arrested? Why didn't the authorities seize him as soon as he came off the plane and hand him over to the International Criminal Courts so that he can stand trial for moving children out of Ukraine? Well, as we saw from the statements earlier, the international courts require the cooperation of other countries, and it is politically very sensitive to arrest the leader of one of the biggest nations in the world. And clearly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates didn't really fancy it. In fact, they're trying to improve their trading relations with Russia. So arresting the president of Russia would obviously be trading suicide, and also may result in some sort of military action against them. And if you look back in history, it's very difficult to find any examples of current leaders of countries being arrested as a result of these warrants. In 1998, the former dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, was arrested in London. However, following objections against this situation, he was subsequently released and sent back to Chile on ill health grounds. And the only example in recent history of somebody being actually arrested in these circumstances was the former leader of Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic, who was actually arrested by the new Prime Minister and flown to The Hague, where he was due to stand trial for war crimes. However, he died before there was any conclusion to that case. So realistically, it's extremely unlikely that President Putin will ever be arrested, particularly because it's extremely unlikely that he will fly to any country where he has the potential of being arrested. I don't think he's going to pay a flying unexpected visit to New York or London at any point in the near future. He's most likely to target countries where he has some form of important trading relationship, and as a result of that relationship, it's very unlikely that the leaders of those countries are going to organise his arrest. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video firstly to talk about the fact that President Putin is now on his travels. He's actually going to visit leaders of other countries. And I think that shows that Russia feels it's moving on to the next phase of what's being called the Second Cold War. We're seeing the deliberate strengthening of relations between Russia and other countries who've remained entirely neutral over the situation in Ukraine. So countries such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, China, India, Iran. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, we will see Russia really looking to embed themselves with those countries and the trading relations. But in terms of what's going on with oil, this is a really interesting time because, as I mentioned at the start of the video, the reason that the price of oil has fallen over the last 6 months or so is because the global economy is slowing down. China is performing at a lower level than everybody expected for 2023, and that's expected to continue into 2024. And a lot of economies around the world are still struggling with the higher interest rates that were introduced to try to bring down inflation. And those higher interest rates have caused a slowdown in many economies. So we've got a situation where there is less demand for oil. And as a direct result of that fall in demand, prices have started to come down. However, OPEC Plus don't like selling oil at low prices. They would rather cut back their supplies, push prices back up and sell a lower volume at a higher profit margin. And as we discussed at the start of the video, that's fine if you're cash rich and you can afford to do that. You can sit back and wait for a couple of years, and then when prices do go back as a result of increased demand because of a growing global economy, you can then release more oil into the market. But this has come at a real pinch point from Russia's point of view. They are sitting at a point in their economy where they need as much revenue as possible. So I'm sure that President Putin would like to pump as much oil as he can into the global economy to gather in all of that cash to keep funding the war effort in Ukraine. However, Russia is one of the biggest players in OPEC Plus, and because Russia is now developing all of these relations with all of these nations, it needs to be seen to be playing the game alongside everybody else. And as a result of that, President Putin made his trip this week as a sign of strength to show that Russia is happy to stand shoulder to shoulder alongside Saudi Arabia and the UAE and anybody else that's announcing cuts in their oil production. But when you look at the economics of the situation, this has to hurt Russia, because cutting back 800,000 barrels of oil per day means that Russia is losing around $16 billion of revenue at the current prices. Now, obviously, the logic here is that if you cut back on production, prices go up and therefore you earn more per barrel. But as we've seen over the last 6 months or so, that hasn't actually been proven. OPEC Plus have announced a number of cuts during 2023, and whilst they had a short-term impact on the market, the price of oil still came down as a result of the fact that the global economy is slowing down. You can't fight against the market unless OPEC Plus cuts back massively, unless they cut back 50% of production, which obviously would send prices sky high. But nobody really wants to do that because realistically, all of these countries have got very used to earning lots of money from oil. Now, I think a really interesting question to throw into the mix at this point is whether or not Russia is voluntarily offering these production cuts, or whether they're starting to have problems with production if they're actually pulling less oil out of the ground because they've lost some of the technology and the trading partners that helped them to build these facilities, companies like ExxonMobil, Shell and BP, all of whom have departed Russia permanently. And there is a genuine possibility here that Russia is using the proposals from OPEC Plus as a cover story to cover the fact that they're actually producing less oil and therefore unable to export as much as they once were. And if that is the situation, then obviously that would have longer term implications for Russia, because even if OPEC Plus does say, okay, we're now back to maximum production, Russia could find itself in a situation where it's unable to fill its quota because of production problems with the Russian facilities. So the overall summary of today's video is that the latest round of cuts from OPEC Plus represent bad news in terms of the volume of income that those countries will earn. It's highly likely that any increase in prices will not offset the total production that they're cutting back on, and therefore overall all of these countries will be earning less in real terms. And that's clearly bad news for Russia, because right now Russia needs as much money as possible to balance the books with its own economy, and it recently announced a further increase in defence spending and a further commitment to the war in Ukraine for 2024. So these latest production cuts represent bad news for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.